And so today we start a new series called Into the Unknown, and it's looking at this idea of the people of God moving from Pharaoh into trusting Yahweh in the wilderness. And before we can do that, I think we're going to start kind of with some backstory, and we'll get to that in a minute. But I want to start today by just telling you something you already know. Raising kids is an adventure. Most of you know that it's an adventure, and there's almost no opinions on how you should do it. You can't find any material on how you should raise kids, is there? Yes, there's an overabundance of it, isn't there? There's things about what you should do and then what you shouldn't do. And a lot of times they're the exact same opposite of the same people saying, you should do this and you shouldn't do this exact same thing. And so you find no shortage of opinions, books, expert advice on raising kids. And it doesn't go very far from a lot of times your own household. To be honest, I knew the most about being a parent well before my kids were ever born. I knew exactly what parents should be doing. I knew what they shouldn't be doing. I knew that I could watch parents and shake my head and be like, I'm never going to do that. I knew definitely what I would not put up with. I knew definitely how my kids would behave. I knew how they would act when they were in public. I knew how they would act when they were out to dinner. I knew how they would act in church. I knew that there was no question about it. It was just going to work out that way. And I knew what all the other parents were doing wrong, to my dismay. I was so just flabbergasted. How come they don't know any better? I knew it all. And then Annalise was born. And my preconceived notions and kind of high roads that I sat upon evaporated within a few days, if not a few hours, of her being born. Shockingly, I'll be honest, one thing I don't remember having an opinion on was the use of pacifiers. Now, this is a picture of Annalise when she was about 2 years old riding in the car. And anyway, I think I was on the way to Florida on a road trip. And just so you don't worry, no, I'm not in the driver's seat taking a picture while we're moving. Okay, I probably was. But anyway, that's a long time ago, so I think the statute of limitations are gone on that. But for all you parents out there, how many of you use pacifiers with your children? Okay. For those of you that did use it, did you call it a pacifier or a passy, something like that? Is there anybody that called it that? A few of you? Was there anybody that called it a binky? How about a storm plug? Did anybody ever use that? My stepdad says that, storm plug. How many of you, did anybody ever call it a pat-pat or just something that I haven't mentioned yet? No, okay. Well, mute button. I like that. The hard part is the button keeps coming back out. That's the only thing. Well, I'll be honest, we went with Binky when our girls were little, and many times we were super grateful for those Binkies. We were super grateful for the pacifiers. Well, it helped a crying baby. It helped kind of soothe them and help them go to sleep, or it just preoccupied them with something so they would keep their mouth closed, or at least partially. And that didn't work so well as they learned to talk with it in their mouth as they got older. But our pacifiers were a great blessing right out of the gate. We found great comfort in it. And there came a point in time, though, when the pacifier kind of wore out its usefulness, right? When the pacifier and the kids kept using it out of habit rather than necessity. It was just one of those things they were so used to having that they had them around there. And it wasn't easy, though, because the kids didn't understand why their binkies are suddenly not allowed just because they had a birthday. I think it was our 4th birthday where Dawn's like, okay, we're going to donate the binkies to the babies that need them, and she'd cut them and throw them away and that kind of stuff. And with both of our kids, honestly, we found some rogue ones hidden underneath their pillows, probably for the next year after that, as they would hide them there. If they woke up in the morning, they'd kind of shove it back under there so we didn't find it. But to be honest, for us, we didn't want them forever needing a binky to go to sleep. And we had heard horror stories from dentists about how it would affect their bite as they grew up. We also didn't want to affect the way that they talk. Now, right or wrong, those were kind of the thoughts we had at the time, or at least what my wife told me why we needed to do it. And I said, okay, because she was the expert. Now, we didn't want this thing that had been a blessing in the past to end up becoming kind of an addiction, right? Now, that may seem like strong language, but if you know the willpower of many toddlers, you know that kind of fits. The idea from this, I think, is important is that things that once blessed us can end up becoming a problem for us and limit us from moving forward, or even entrap us and keep us where we are. When we look at the early life of the descendants of Abraham in the book of Genesis and Exodus, we actually see this idea play out on a much larger and impactful scale. In Genesis chapter 37, we read about Jacob, and he settles down and he has 12 sons, but he loves his son Joseph the most. Do you all remember the story of Joseph and his Technicolor dream coat? Or his coat of many colors? Do you know what happened to him? Anybody remember what happened to Joseph? Sold into slavery, yeah, right? What happened after he sold into slavery? Anybody know where he went? Egypt. And then what happened when he got there? Moved up. He was with Potiphar first, right? Do you remember what happened with Potiphar? Yeah? Wife accused him, right? He gets thrown back into prison. And then, what's his ticket out of prison? Do you remember? Dreams, interpreting dreams. And so he interprets dreams, and he eventually interprets dreams for the Pharaoh, and he eventually becomes kind of the Pharaoh's right-hand man in charge of many of his resources in his courts, right? Yeah. You all did awesome. You passed the Sunday school test. You got all those answers really well. I saw a lot of nods, and some great group participation there. That's what I'm looking for, so thank you for that. And so Joseph positions Pharaoh through his new position, though, to have a reserve of food for when a famine comes. That was part of the dream he interpreted, was that there was going to be years of plenty followed by years of famine. And so he positioned Pharaoh in Egypt in such a way that they would have plenty of reserves when the famine came. And when the famine comes, the land of his fathers and brothers, and when it hits that land, his fathers and his brothers end up coming to Egypt to seek help. And they come to Pharaoh's court looking for help without realizing that it was Joseph who was in charge of this whole thing. You probably remember that part too. Now, he initially hides who he is, which seems to be a family tradition, doesn't it? I mean, you have Jacob and Esau, you have even Abraham and Sarah in Egypt when they say like, oh, well, that's not my wife, that's, whatever else. But there seems to be this family tradition of hiding who you are, and Joseph carries it on when he's in Egypt. I almost said Europe, but he was in Egypt, not in Europe. And so they get there, and he reveals to his brothers and fathers finally who he is, and there's this great reunion that we read about. And the reunion and this powerful story of what had happened to them and how they were reunited is so powerful that it makes its way to Pharaoh. And we're going to pick the story up there in Genesis chapter 45. We're going to begin with the 16th verse. And here's what we read. The news soon reached Pharaoh's palace. Joseph's brothers have arrived. Pharaoh and his officials were all delighted to hear this. Pharaoh said to Joseph, tell your brothers that this is what you must do. Load your pack animals and hurry back to the land of Canaan. Then get your father and all your families and return here to me. I will give you the very best land in Egypt, and you will eat from the best that the land produces. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, tell your brothers, take wagons from the land of Egypt to carry your little children and your wives, and bring your father here. Don't worry about your personal belongings, for the best of all the land of Egypt is yours. I don't remember that verse so much. I remember the story in general, but that verse was that passage is pretty interesting. What a blessing. Can you imagine all the fear and just worry that the family had been living under? Can you imagine wondering if you'll have enough food maybe for another month? That you're worried, like, man, are we even going to make it? And to not only look at the prospect for yourself and maybe your immediate family, but your extended family. It says that there was like 70 all in total. So you're in charge, you and your brothers are trying to figure out how are we going to feed 70 mouths with the prospect of this famine. Have any of you ever tried to feed 70 people? No. Sometimes we're worried about just feeding 7 people. Sometimes we're worried about just feeding 2 people or 1 person and how we're going to make it work. But I imagine that pressure of that, even though it was distributed across these 11 brothers, that there was this pressure of what are we going to do? What are we going to do for our brothers, our sister-in-laws, our nieces, our nephews, even that crazy uncle and those crazy cousins you might have. I'm sure if you don't have a crazy uncle or a crazy cousin, then you might be it for your family. Just a little clue there. But anyway, every family seems to have those. But can you imagine just worrying about everybody? What are they going to do? Even Uncle Eddie in his RV as he pulls up. What are we going to do to take care of everybody? I imagine being worried when they've exhausted all known options. And so Jacob's family, the family of Abraham, who had been promised prosperity by God, they step into an unknown situation in Egypt. And in the midst of all their fear and all their worry and all their doubt, in the midst of not knowing what tomorrow would bring or where they would eat, they're rescued. And so it's one thing to be rescued yourself, but everyone you know gets rescued as well. The whole family's getting rescued. And if you're concerned about where that rescue is located, because you might be thinking like, okay, these Egyptians, sure, they're going to make us all these promises, but is it going to become true? Your fears will be put to rest because your long-lost brother is there, and not only is he there, but he has an in with the head honcho, right? It's a tremendous blessing where we read and we see this thread of faithfulness of God, and in spite of decisions of the people of God, you have a God who rescues them through the resources of Egypt, thanks to the brother Joseph, after Joseph came through his own terrible ordeal. Now, sometimes people think that they can step in the way of God's plans, the same way that Joseph's brothers did. They ignored his dream and sold him as a slave, but God's plans are not up for debate or vote by 2/3 of a majority. No, God's plans come to fruition every time at his own time. And we should be reminded of that on this 8th day of Christmas. That God's plan at the fullness of time becomes reality every time. What a blessing it is to be the recipients of God's good and gracious plans. Amen? If you are sitting here today or you're watching online today, you have benefited from the gracious blessings of God, whether you recognize it or not. All blessings, by design, flow from God to his creation so that people may properly respond to the goodness of God as he invites them into relationship and partnership in life. You and I are no different. God's blessings allow us to experience the goodness of God so that we would recognize God for who he is. And when we recognize God for who he is, then we will give him glory through worship. And worship doesn't just mean singing 3 or 4 songs on a Sunday. Worship is a whole life attitude of response to the goodness of God and who he is. And so when we recognize that God is who he is, and he is the creator and the originator of not only creation and not only you and me, but also the blessings that we have in our life and the future, the plan that he has for us, then we can, when we come into that recognition, then we can properly give him worship and glory and honor. We can also partner with him to share the blessings and recognition with those in our life. Right? That's what our testimonies do, is that we share the recognition of who God is, because not everybody knows. The blessing itself isn't the goal, but blessings are a byproduct of a relationship with a God who loves us. Right? A good example of that, or a good maybe illustration of that, is marriage. If you think the only reason you get married is for what happens in the bedroom, then you're not really have a marriage, right? That's a byproduct, that's a blessing of being married. That's not the point of getting married. And if you thought it was, well then I'll offer marriage counseling to anybody that's interested in it. But you come soon to realize that that is a byproduct or a blessing of being married. It is something that comes out of that, not the reason for being married. In the same way, the blessings that we get from God are a byproduct of a relationship with God, not the point of God. For the Israelites, this blessing of Egypt would eventually start to change, though. And as the story of God moves from Genesis into Exodus, we see how the blessing eventually changes. We're looking at Exodus chapter 1, beginning in the 6th verse. And here's what we read. In time, Joseph and all of his brothers died, ending their entire generation. But their descendants, the Israelites, had many children and grandchildren. In fact, they multiplied so greatly that they became extremely powerful and filled the land. Eventually, a new king came to power in Egypt who knew nothing about Joseph or what he had done. He said to his people, "Look, the people of Israel now outnumber us and are stronger than we are. We must make a plan to keep them from growing even more. If we don't, and if war breaks out, they will join our enemies and fight against us. Then they will escape from our country." So the Egyptians made the Israelites their slaves. They appointed brutal slave drivers over them, hoping to wear them down with crushing labor. They forced them to build the cities of Pithom and Ramses as supply centers for the king. But the more the Egyptians oppressed them, the more the Israelites multiplied and spread, and the more alarmed the Egyptians became. So the Egyptians worked the people of Israel without mercy. They made their lives bitter, forcing them to mix mortar and make bricks and do all the work in the field. They were ruthless in their demands. It's interesting because the land that had been their rescue, the country and people that had provided for God's blessing, had now changed. The circumstances around them had changed. And the country of their blessing has become the place of their bondage. So what happened? I mean, why did that change? And do you think that God was surprised by this? I mean, do you think he sent them there and then was like, what in the world? This has gotten out of hand? Well, in case you would think that, I think that's a good question. We should approach things sometimes with that question. We know this isn't the case because we look at a prophecy that God gave Abraham all the way back in Genesis chapter 15. In Genesis chapter 15, and I encourage you to read the whole chapter, but we see these two verses. It says, "As the sun was going down, Abram," he was still Abram at the time, "fell into a deep sleep, and a terrifying darkness came down over him. Then the Lord said to Abram, 'You can be sure that your descendants will be strangers in a foreign land where they will be oppressed as slaves for 400 years.'" So all the way back in Genesis 15, this prophecy of what would turn out to be in Exodus chapter 1 was given to Abraham. Now, some people might be tempted to think, okay, so God planned their slavery? And I think that's a great question. Does God speaking to a future event mean that he is causing it to happen? Or does it simply mean that God is all-knowing and has wisdom about events that will happen in our future? Now, I personally think, and you're welcome to disagree with me, but I personally believe that God has pre-knowledge, or foreknowledge, we call it sometimes, and that's different than causing it to happen. Now, sometimes God does cause things to happen, but I think just because he knows about something in the future doesn't mean that he is orchestrating it towards that future. Now, regardless of where you fall on that, though, what this demonstrates is that God is not caught off guard by the circumstances of the lives of his people, even if his people are. God's not surprised. Now, I'll be honest with you, knowing that God's not surprised by what's going to happen tomorrow and the next day and a year down the road gives me great comfort and even gives me great confidence to step into the unknown of every second, minute, hour, and day that is on the other side of right now. Because I know that God's already there. God's already seen it. God's maybe sent me through a time of preparation. God's already preparing different things for us to be there. We call it prevenient grace, that God is on the other side of right now. He goes before us. Right? Isn't it good that any bit of news that we receive, anything that we might hear, good, bad, or in between, is not news to God? That's good. That God isn't shocked when the rails fall off of our lives, when a diagnosis comes in that we never saw coming, when things don't work out for us. God is not shocked, nor is he surprised when things go better than we expected them to go, when situations surprise and wow us, or when the test results are positive. Neither of those cases has God knocked off his rocker. I don't think God's on a rocker, but you get the saying. And that reiterates a point to us that God is with us now and in the future that he already sees. And so we don't have to think like, oh, what happens? God, you got this for me right now, but I'm so comfortable, I don't want to go to the next place because what if you aren't there? Because he's there too. Nothing will knock him off his throne or cause him to stumble or just freeze in complete shock. That's not going to happen to God. He's not going to be like, I don't know what to do. He's not going to get paralysis by analysis. He's not going to be just have no way to understand what's going on. God knows. As you and I look at the blank canvas that is 2023, save for a few hours, we can either try to figure out all the unknowns of things that are going to happen, or we can entrust our unknowns to a God that invites us to know him by way of relationship and revelation. We can wait until we have everything figured out, or we can participate following God's lead, knowing he already has it all figured out. And so things might not go as we expected them, but they're exactly as God knew they were going to happen. And so if God goes with us, then we can have peace and we can have rest in that. And like a pacifier that was super helpful at 2 months has become a hindrance at 200 months, the blessing of Egypt's provisions eventually become bondage. Now my grandpa on my dad's side, I think he's going to celebrate his 94th birthday here in this month in January. And he's provided his fair share of thoughts and wisdom over the years that I've known him. And he's fairly opinionated, and I'm sure that's shocking if you've ever spent time with me. But he has thoughts and opinions on all kinds of things, and he has some wisdom mixed in as well. And one time I remember talking to him in my teens, and I said, I really want to get a car, Grandpa. And he was like, well, why do you want to get a car? And I said, well, because I want to have my own ride to my job. And he said, well, why do you have the job? And I said, well, so I can buy the car. He said, be careful. Because the job we got to buy the car soon becomes the job we need to pay for the upkeep and the gas and the insurance on the car. And the car I wanted to own now owns me. Do you find it interesting that things we own have the potential to own us? That the things that we own can make the decisions what we do with our time. That the things that we decide that we need make decisions about what to do with our money. That they make decisions about what we focus on and what we prioritize because, hey, we have to pay for what we've already made a commitment to. I think I've used the example before, but I have met many number of people that said, I would love to go on a mission trip. I feel like I would just love it. And I say, why don't you go? And they said, I can't afford it. And there's been a couple people that are brave enough to sit down with their finances and say, let's see if we can figure this out for one. The other side of it is I say, well, can you trust God? But for a lot of people, they've said, well, I have this car payment. Well, we have 2 car payments. And I said, well, how long have you been paying on this? Well, about 3 years, and I have another 3 years to go. And it's like, so 3 years ago, you made a financial decision that is impacting you today, that is deciding for you today that you can't do something because of a decision you made 3 years ago. And I know that everybody needs a vehicle, but that's just an example sometimes of how we can get into things and we think we need something. And I'm not saying we don't, but I'm saying sometimes in that case where someone can't answer what they feel like God has laid upon their heart because they made a decision 3 years ago to spend that money ahead of time. And I'm not preaching and saying, like, you shouldn't do that. And so this isn't a negative. I'm just saying that's how this works. And looking at the nods in this room, you all know that. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. Sometimes, though, the things we own have the potential to own us and make decisions for us because we've given that permission days, maybe even years ago. And even if it isn't entirely bad, I definitely don't think it's entirely good either. The blessing of a place to survive for the Israelites turns to become a place that God's people are worried that they may never survive. But wasn't it their worry of survival that led them there in the first place? They are entrapped by the very people who played a key role in their rescue. So what should they do? There's an echo. I like that. For all the people in the back maybe that didn't get it the first time. So what should God's people do? They're worried. Exodus 2 tells us what they're going to do. Or actually what they do. Verse 23, here's what we read in Exodus chapter 2. And it says, years passed and the king of Egypt died, but the Israelites continued to groan under their burden of slavery. They cried out for help, and their cry rose up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He looked down on the people of Israel and knew it was time to act. The people of God let their cries for help be lifted up to God. And despite not reading about their devotion or seeking God before things got really bad, we don't know because it doesn't detail it in the scripture. We don't know where their devotion was. We don't know how good of Israelites they had been. We don't know if they had been seeking him all along, or this moment in time came and they finally started crying out and saying, God, can you save us from our saviors? Because that's what the Egyptians had been to that point. They had rescued them. They had seen them in a lot of ways as their savior. And so God hears their cries in the midst of their suffering. I want to remind you and encourage us together that if you are needing a move of God, then direct the cries of your heart, not to everybody else. I mean, it's okay to share with other people your burdens, but that you ultimately allow the cries of your heart to go to God, who is mighty to save. And sometimes I wonder if God is a last-ditch option for us. Because it seems like we talk to the people around us, we talk to our friends, we call people on the phones, and we talk about everything that's going on well before we ever prayed about it. And most of the people you call, most of the people that you share with, I'll be honest, probably aren't going to be able to save those deep heart issues the way that God can. And so sometimes, if I'm feeling really brave, and it's only been like once or twice, so don't think that I'm toot my own horn, someone will come to me and say, Pastor, can you pray for this? And I'll say, have you prayed for it already? Because I'm happy to pray for anybody. But I want to join you in prayer. I don't want to lead the charge for you. I mean, I will, but too many times we medicate the pain of life with so many other things. For some, we work because at least we're accomplishing something. And we feel like as we work, we accomplish something. For others, we make money. We try to save our way to security and to peace. While others, we spend money trying to consume enough to validate that we're important because we're buying things that we deserve, and we distract our attention from what's going on in life. And on and on and on. Those things are not inherently evil, but sometimes we use them to medicate the pain of life. And so we point with our brains and our hearts, and we shoot our mental and emotion energy in the hopes that we'll hit some unknown target and somehow we'll just be happy. All the while, God offers himself. Not as a cosmic Santa that simply gives gifts to the good and gives coal to the bad, but as the designer of our lives and author of the story that he created us for. And so when we join with God in relationship, we are validated by his creation of us, his love for us, his offer for forgiveness, redemption, and adoption, an invitation to participate in what he is doing, joining together with him for life and life abundantly. That's by design. Blessings are great, but the true blessing is personally and intimately knowing God and being known by God. If you are full of the love of God, then who cares if anybody else loves you? I mean, I don't say that in a way that we can say, oh, forget everybody else, I only need God's love. But it's one of those things where we're not so needy. We're not chasing things because we're looking for validation. We don't have to kind of bow down to everyone's opinion. Instead, we can say, God loves me, and that is good enough for me. You know, my kids over the years have given me all kinds of art to hang on the refrigerator. If there has been no bigger, I won't call it a fight, maybe debate. There has been no bigger debate in the times that we have moved since having kids than what's going to happen to the art that our kids have created and hung in refrigerators and piled up and brought home in book bags from school. It's valuable to us, not because it's a work of art, but because of who did it, right? Now, my daughter is artistically inclined, one of them, so I will say, there's my little plug for her. She's a great artist. But when you go to an art museum, and there's a Picasso, and you're saying, I don't even know what that is, but there's a price tag of several million, what makes it valuable? The artist. And so the reason that you and I have value is not because everybody else approves of us, it's because of the artist who created us. And so when we can rest in our value because we have been created by a God who does not make mistakes, who does not say, whoops, what happened, I didn't mean for you to be here, then we know, okay, everybody else's thoughts, they're cool, whatever. But the God, creator of the universe, has created me and loved me so much that he sent his son so that I can know him and have life. That's the reason that we don't worship the blessing. We worship the one who truly blesses. So many times we get discouraged because our blessings have turned to sour milk or just kind of faded away. We get these rose-colored glasses and say, man, the glory days were the olden days, and they're just not like they used to be. Sometimes we wallow in it and we think it'll never get any better. Other times we come up with our own plans and we say, well, I'm not going to just sit around and wait for God. I'm going to make something happen. Or I'm going to make it at least tolerable. But what if instead of these options of either just wallowing in the fact that the blessing isn't there anymore, or just doing it on our own, we instead try to clutch and grab and hang on to God? That we try to hold on to him and entrust the unknown things of tomorrow to him. What if instead of trying to hold on to what we know and say, well, here's what I know and I'm going to do things this way, we trust him? Even if that means giving him things and people we thought we had all figured out. You ever have that happen? I'm sure there's people in your family that you know so well that you even know how they're going to act before they do it. But what if God does a work in their life and completely changes them? Are you going to sit back and say, well, they need to show to me that they've changed? Or are you going to say, man, that's awesome. God has changed them. What if you have to release people to God? What if you are in disharmony with someone? That's a nice way to put it. And you're saying, they did this to me, they did this to me, they did this to me. And God said, love them and let me figure out the details. Can you trust him with that person? Can you trust him with that relationship? Can you trust him with that situation? What if God asks you to take a step where we don't know the end of the trail, what it even looks like? Where God's saying to go down this path, and we're saying, but God, I know if I stay at this job, I know if I keep going this, I know if I keep doing this, that this will happen. And God's saying, but I'm calling you to something where you don't know where it's going to go. Can we trust him with that? Or do we say, God, I need a plan from you. I need an outline, I need a timetable, I need what's needed, what I need to prepare for. And he's saying, just come and follow me. The preparation is in your heart. Follow me. What if we leaned into knowing God more than we do now? I don't know where that is in your life. I don't know how much you lean into God, how much you lean into trusting him. But what if wherever you are, you were more trusting of God this year? He's readily available to reveal himself more. And what if you leaned into that more than trying to lean into things that we can never fully know or control? We love to be in control, don't we? We like to mitigate risk. Say, well, if I do this, I know it's going to get done right. And if I keep these things this way, I know everything is going to go okay. And then something happens and we're so shocked, like we didn't control the whole thing. Like, what? We're not nearly as in control as we like to think we are. And so what if we trusted the unknown to God and leaned into him? The people of Israel, they had reached that point where the circumstances of their life finally drove them beyond what their blessing had become. And like a child that grew up and no longer needs a pacifier, the Israelites had outgrown their blessing of Egypt, and it was now a place of bondage. They called out to God. He heard their cry, and at the right time, God acted. This morning, I invite you to prayerfully enter into the same pattern of behavior. When you find yourself in a place where a path becomes unknown, that when you find yourself there, that instead of just scrambling, instead of getting bogged down with worry, that you set your voice to cry out to a known God. Instead of trying to figure out all the details of the unknown, you look to the known. Instead of figuring it all out on your own, or letting it give you the message that you should just give up, hold on to God for His guidance and His wisdom. Maybe 2023 would be a year that more than anything, God demonstrated Himself once again as faithful in your life. We just sang about it. What if that testimony were on display every day of this year? What if He was faithful in the blessing and He was faithful in the waiting? If He was faithful in abundance and faithful in the shortage, faithful in the now as well as faithful in the future? What if that's the God that you came to know? Since your life is the stage for Him to demonstrate that faithfulness on, the question becomes, will you trust Him enough to surrender the stage to Him? Enough to take yourself out of the spotlight, thinking it all depends on you, to give it to God and His work. I want to encourage us today. Let's entrust individually and corporately as a church. Let's entrust our unknowns to Jesus, the one who made Himself known on that first Christmas 2,000 years ago. He is making all things new, not just this year, but also me and you. And it's by His grace and by His power that will happen. And so I just want to encourage us today that if our blessings have turned, if we find ourselves maybe not in slavery, but in bondage, or just feeling like we're under this dark cloud, that God will hear our cries, and He will come, and He has a plan. Even in the midst of a trying time, remember, whatever you're in right now is not the end of the story. It might just be a chapter in the story. And there is more to be written by the grace and to the glory of God. Will you stand with me?